Welcome to the podcast, An Ancient Language for a Modern Soul, Poemi Conviviali by Giovanni Pascoli. I'm here today with Professor Maria Truglio, who teaches Italian literature, women and gender studies at Penn State University in the US. Maria wrote a wonderful book on Pascoli called Beyond the Family Romance, The Legend of Pascoli, in which she explores Pascoli's poetry from a psychoanalytical perspective. Today we will talk about Anticlos, a poem narrating the last night of the Trojan War. You can listen to the poem in the translation published in 2022 by James Ackers and myself for Italica Press. The poem is read by David Carter. The music is by Giovanni Tardini, played at the Celtic harp by Arianna Mornico. Well, thank you, Maria, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Elena. I really just want to say it's a true joy to be able to chat about this poem with you, and also to thank you not only for this invitation for today, but also for your beautiful volume and for bringing this amazing collection into the English-speaking world.
Thank you, Maria. That's lovely to hear. So I'd like to start this episode today by quoting a modern book. That's Pat Barker's The Women of Troy. In this novel, Barker tells us of the fate of the Trojan women who were made captive by the Greeks after the war on Troy ended. In chapter 5 of this book, Helen of Troy recounts one episode of the last night of Troy when the Greek soldiers were inside the wooden horse, ready to sack the city. I walked all the way around it, singing Greek songs, says Helen. Love songs, says another character, but even those who did remember her singing could never agree on the song. It was as if every man had heard the song that meant most to him. So when I read these lines in Parker's book, I was quite surprised because, as far as I know, this particular episode is not very well represented in modern retellings of this story. And the only other source where this particular episode is found is Pascoli's poem Anticlos. So this poem takes the reader to a point in the story of the Trojan War that is not narrated in the Iliad. Iliad ends with Achilles returning Hector's body to Priam, but Homer, or the author of the Iliad, doesn't narrate the last night of the war when the Greeks enter Troy, thanks to the stratagem of the wooden horse. Well, a wooden horse, as you know, is built and filled with soldiers while the Greek army pretends to leave. The Trojans think that the horse is an offering to the gods and they take it into the city. Night falls, the Greek soldiers are inside the horse waiting for a good moment to exit and sack the city while the enemy is asleep and defenseless. And it's at that point that they hear a woman's voice singing. It's Helen singing in a way that to each man sounds like their own wife or loved one, to entice the soldiers into coming out of the wooden horse. And the first stanza of Pascoli's poem is actually a ring composition, starting and ending with Helen's voice. Let's hear it.
Inside the wooden horse, Anticlos cried out in response to that heavenly voice he heard. Or he would have cried out if Odysseus hadn't covered his mouth, saving the heroes still calling out those heroes' names. That winged voice faded into the distance. And finally, all that could be heard was the short breathing of the heroes, just like before, when they were entranced by the enormous hubbub of the waking day, by the crystalline singing of choruses of girls, which they listened to in the dark of night. Then it disappeared, because maybe it was night, and the evening star was already shivering over the sea. Maybe it was night with a full moon rising out of the hills. And there it was, a voice that circled the wooden horse and that sounded like the voice that each man most wanted to hear. every heart has a voice it longs for most. It was the woman that each of them loved, the far-off, unreachable woman they loved, suddenly appearing from across the sea waves in the dark mountains, suddenly there. And each man jumped like he was placing a foot on the mossy doorstep of his home. A look from Odysseus reined them all in. All but Anticlos. Anticlos was a force, but only because he was forced to be. No tales of glory babbled in his heart, just slender cypresses, a sunny vineyard, and his woman, whose voice he now heard, and he was there, across the dark mountains, across the sea waves, and she was pushing the loom away and coming up the stairs. The door was opening, and he opened his lips, and the heavy hand of Odysseus shut them. The man with 100 tricks and ways. Then he heard in the seashell of his ear a harsh whisper, like a cold sea breeze. It's Helen. Helen. Death, you fool.
And Maria, how do you interpret Helen's voice?
Oh, yeah, Elena, I mean, it's such a compelling and I guess multifaceted sort of moment here that Pascali picks up on. I also just want to mention quickly in talking about modern renditions of this scene, Pascali also wrote about this moment in Latin, right? In one of his many Latin compositions. So he's definitely thinking a lot about it. So for me at this moment, Helen's voice, is sort of a representative of the idea of pure presence, right? Pure presence or plenitude. But also, as we go on in the poem, it is necessarily in this sort of philosophic economy, let's say for Pascali, it's also death, right? So it's both pure presence and death. And it's really such an intriguing moment in the poem, right? First of all, we're never told what she says, right? What is the semantic value of her words? What is she singing about? We don't know. Rather, it's actually the airy or the heavenly voice in and of itself that has literally the power to move, right? The power to move the hidden soldiers. Second, it's a bit ambiguous in Pascali's poem, I think. If Helen is, walking around the horse and changing her voice to imitate each of the wives or each of the loved ones, one by one, or rather, and this second option is the one to me that I think is more likely and more interesting, whether she is speaking in a single voice that each soldier simultaneously hears as the voice of his beloved. So this second possibility would mean that Helen's voice, it's sort of like the white light of the sun that encompasses within itself all of the colors, right? All the colors of the rainbow, as it were. And then that white light, right? I should be careful when I'm using scientific metaphors, since that is not but based on a very elementary understanding of science, right? So then that white light then is perceived by each soldier in the specific color, right, or tone that belongs to his wife. So it's certainly an imperfect metaphor, but I think it gets at this idea of presence and wholeness and fullness that I think Helen's voice represents. And we can note too, right, that at the sound of Helen's voice, each far off, unreachable woman suddenly appears, is suddenly there, right? That's the language Pascali is using. Pascali doesn't say that each soldier remembers his wife or thinks about his wife, but that in fact she is conjured into presence by Helen's voice. And, just again to look closely at the language that Pascali uses, to me, it's really interesting, his use of the verb empire, which means to fill, in this one line, when he says, se a lui la bocca non empia col pugno, right? So a very literal translation would be, if he, meaning Odysseus, if he had not filled Anticlos's mouth with his fist. Right. To me, it's an intriguing verse because Pascali here is following Homer's original text pretty closely, but he chooses a different verb here. In Homer, and a shout out to my son who was a classics major and helped me out with this, right? In Homer, the Greek verb here would more literally be translated by the Italian premere, to press, to squeeze, to press tight. But Pascali changes this verb to use the verb for to fill, empire. So I think we see here the ambivalence of filling up the void, right? He wants to like filling the empty mouth with a fist. And this is another change that Pascali makes to the Homer, right? Homer talks about Odysseus's hand. Pascali says fist, which to me is a more violent image, right? So we're already starting to see, well, this desire, the desire that you talk about in your book for fullness and presence and wholeness is really strong. It also, right, has this potentially violent undertone, right? And I think as we go through and as we'll I think keep discussing, becomes also linked to a drive towards death.
That's very interesting, Maria. Thank you very much. And as you know, myself, I've thought long and hard about this poem. And for me, as you said, this poem is also about desire. Because the voice of Helen, precisely because it's separated from her body, comes to represent somehow the true object of the soldiers' desire, which is the bodies of their wives. And they almost act upon their desire, which is, it must have been quite strong after 10 years of being apart.
Right.
And Helen almost succeed in making them come out of the horse. So for me, like Helen's voice really acts like an empty signifier that each soldier fills with their own fantasies. And on the other hand, we know that the character of Helen of Troy is sort of a symbol or a byword for desire, as she is the face who launched 1,000 ships, as Christopher Marlowe famously wrote. And Maria, I know you wrote about the notion of simulacrum when it comes to Helen vis-a-vis the wives. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes, for sure. And I really love that formulation you just offered there, the empty signifier, right? That the soldiers can fill in. We don't really get a very in-depth or detailed description. I mentioned we don't know what she says, but we don't get a very in-depth description of the specific quality of her voice either, right? We only hear that it's airy or heavenly. So I think that, you know, we as readers can become like the soldiers, sort of filling in or imagining our own sort of auditory image of that voice, that empty signifier. In terms of this sort of play of the simulacrum, I think, you know, Pascali crafts the poem in a way that really prompts us to consider how the relationship between Helen on the one hand and all the individual wives on the other hand sort of flips from our first impression. So initially, it seems that Helen is imitating the wives' voices somehow, right? That she is copying, right? She is the copy of their original voices and of them. But by the end of the poem, and you know, I know we'll come to that later, I think we're sort of pushed to reconsider that relationship as the opposite, right? Namely that each wife ultimately is the pale or the partial simulacrum of the original ideal that Helen represents. So I will say, as a feminist, I'm not really in love with that idea, right? It seems to suggest, wait a minute here, because it does seem to suggest that real women are all imperfect copies of some ideal prototype of woman, right? Of the perfect woman. But I think that this is how Helen is functioning for Pascali, as he's thinking through and poetically representing ideas about desire, right? And again, you know, to take it down to the details of the poem, even on this sort of phonic level, right? We have this hypnotic repetition of soluna, soluna, throughout the poem, right? Only one, right? Only one woman for each soldier. And then in the end, that becomes te sola, you alone. And we can see this flip here even in the word order. Only one, you only, right? So Pascali is creating a chiasmus here, right? A chiasmus, which is a crisscrossing of the word order that I think shows us this flip or this crisscrossing of sort of original and copy, where that goes on over the course of the poem.
Well, thank you, Maria. And right, I'm not in love with this view of women either. But that's how it's here in this poem. And in the next stanza, actually, we meet the protagonist, the male protagonist, Anticlos. And who is Anticlos? I mean, he's not one of the great heroes in the Iliad. In fact, he's only mentioned in 2 lines of the Odyssey. That's book 4, line 277 and 279. He is actually the anti-hero, at least in Pascali's poem, because he cares nothing for glory or spoils. He is a force, but only because he was forced to be. And when he hears Ellen's voice, he suddenly thinks of his wife in a very domestic and peaceful setting, his home. And when I read this, I thought about what Jacques Lacan says about desire, that our desire is triggered by the other person's desirousness, in fact, by their desire for us. Or in other words, we desire someone, especially when we see that they desire us also. And in fact, in the lines we heard before, we can almost visualize Anticlos' wife coming towards him after so many years with a loving attitude. And speaking of women in Pascali, you have often looked, Maria, in your work at female figures in Pascali. So can you tell us a bit about them? How does Pascali usually represent femininity in Poemi Conviviali and elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks, Elena. That's a great question and a really big question, right? Pascali was pretty prolific. So just speaking very broadly, if we go back to Pascali's famous essay in which he elaborates his theory of poetry, we remember that this figure of the child, right, the fanciullino, which is the title of that essay, encapsulates his thinking about poetics, right? So in a word, and of course I'm simplifying here, but in a word, the poet is the adult who allows the inner child, understood in a very idealized way, to speak, right? And linked to this notion of the poet as channeling a childlike vision of wonder is the assertion that because children are pre-erotic, poetry for Pascali excludes the erotic, right? So in this way, Pascali and Freud, who I use a lot to understand Pascali's poetry, are quite antithetical, right? Pascali is embracing this idea of the child as pre-erotic, pre-sexual, innocent and pure. So this is a surprising thing to say when we think about the rich tradition of love poetry in Italy, right? That true poetry doesn't represent sexual or romantic love because that's not part of the child's world. So, I wonder if Petrarch might have something to say about that. But in fact, in most of Pascali's poetry, female figures are typically not objects of romantic or erotic desire, right? There's not a Laura figure or a Beatrice figure in Pascali's work, typically, right? Instead, we primarily see figures that are sisterly or maternal. And often these female figures are connected in some way to death, right? To bring us back to that theme. In fact, in one essay that I wrote about this poem, Anticlo, I put together with another poem called La Voce from a different collection. I think it's Canti di Castelvecchio. It is, right?
Yes.
And in that poem, La Voce, which means the voice, right? Which is, of course, why I put these together. The voice, Pascali imagines his dead mother speaking to him and, in fact, calling him by his nickname. And as a parenthesis, I would say, I think what's so brilliant about Pascali, or one of the things that's so brilliant about him and his work, is how he drew from his specific biographical experiences, especially the deaths of so many family members, to create poetry that so beautifully and so hauntingly meditates on these broadly shared human experiences like desire and loss and mourning. So coming back specifically to the Conviviali, we encounter here a number of mother figures specifically, right? And many from almost all from the classical world. So we meet Olympia, the mother of Alexandros, Livia, the mother of Tiberius, the mother of Narcissus, and then in the final poem, the Virgin Mother, right? For me, these mothers suggest that the gesture of turning back to the classical world, which is really Pascoli's project here in the Conviviali, is a kind of reiteration or a rearticulation of going back to childhood, right? Going back to infancy, to that primary relationship with the mother. And both of these gestures are driven by a kind of desire for something perceived to have been lost.
Well, thank you, Maria. And I must say that Anticlos may well be longing for his lost childhood and peace and his home, but desire in this poem makes him actually violent. And once he is inside the city, he burns and destroys precisely because he's so desperate to hear that voice again. And so during his night of violence, he himself is mortally wounded. And on his deathbed, he asks to have Helen sing with the voice of his wife. So let's pause to hear the story.
But Anticlos thought of his woman as he lay there dying in the sonorous hall of that great house, which now went up like a tottering pine devoured by flame. And through the flash, Anticlos saw Latus standing in the doorway. Immediately he called to him, Latus, son of Electrion, find Menelaus the conqueror, whose mighty cry of war I hear. Tell him the blood leaks from my veins like wine out of a broken jug. Tell him that I'm dying for him and for his woman, though I have mine in my heart. Tell him to bring Helen, to speak to me in the voice of my woman, the voice that I most want to hear. Every heart has a voice that it longs for most.
And then clearly there is something very powerful here at the root of Anticlos' desire. And at the root of each desire, each individual desire, there is something we all long for that Lacan called jouissance. And I think, Maria, you discussed jouissance in relation to the women in Pascoli's poems who are somehow always at the threshold of life and death.
Exactly. And I think Calypso would be a really great example of this from the Conviviali, a different poem. She appears at the moment of Ulysses' death, right as he's asking, who am I, who was I, in the longest poem in the Conviviali, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
So we have these figurations in which, on the one hand, a drive to overcome the limitations and the boundaries of the self seems to be fulfilled. But this also entails a certain kind of a shipwreck of the self, right? The dissolution of the individual. And in Anticlo, specifically, Pascoli, I think, really cleverly and powerfully inscribes this sort of ambivalent drive into this one verse in which Odysseus tries to prevent Anticlos from responding to Helen, right? And in Italian, the Elena, e la morte infante, right? Helen, it's death, child, right? And the word infante that Pascoli uses, you translate as fool, which I really love. It really captures really effectively this double-edgedness of this desire, right? It's a fool's errand to run after Helen, right? In a more literal way, and I think this would have sounded somewhat odd in English to render it this way, but the infante, right, infant, child, carries that idea of return to childhood, a return to infancy, that is connected to and dramatized by all these mother figures. But etymologically, and certainly Pascali was super well aware of this. He's in spite of his claims of being childlike, he's super erudite, right?
Yes, he is.
Oh my. Etymologically, this infante signifies one who does not speak, right? One who is without language. So in the poem about voice and desire and desire for presence, we have this one verse linking Helen directly to death and to silence, right? So I kind of understand this in the framework of some of Freud's ideas, and specifically his essay on the uncanny. And as you know, in my work, I really see Pascali's poems as really profoundly uncanny in many ways. And in this essay, Freud describes infancy precisely as, and here I quote the English translation, a time when the ego had not yet marked itself off sharply from the external world and from other people. Right? So Pascali, I think, gives us all these figurations of the drive to go back to that time, that ecstatic time when there was no separation between me and not me, but also the ways in which that fantasy can only be fulfilled through death, right? Through the dissolution of the self.
Yes. Right. Thank you, Maria. That was a very good exploration of the women and what are the threshold of life and death. Thank you so much. And now we are down to the last stanza, and I say it's enigmatic because after all of this, Anticlos is before Helen, and she's about to sing to him with the voice of his wife. But let's hear what happens.
So it was that as Anticlos lay dying, Helen came to him, silently as a dream. Around her the conflagration blazed, and above the conflagration shone the moon. And she passed silently, serenely as the moon, over the blood and flames. The flame soared higher as she passed, the blood cooled in the dying veins. The last houses came crashing down. Men's last gasps hung in the air. She stood over Anticlos where he lay dying, thinking of his woman far away. The warriors fell silent, hoarse from the war cry. The slave girls fell silent in their torn robes, and her mouth was just about to open with that faraway voice, the voice of his woman, so that he could carry it with him to Hades. Her lips were opening when Anticlos said, "Stop. I want to remember you alone."
So, Maria, why do you think he chooses Helen?
Oh, it's such a surprising and powerful ending. And, on a non-critical personal level, I certainly hope my husband would not make such a choice. Oh my. But I really love how the conclusion circles back in some ways to the beginning, right? We start with Odysseus silencing Anticlos, and now Anticlos silences Helen. And I think this dramatization shows us that desire to be in the full presence of presence, right? And we can imagine Anticlos thinking, I don't want to summon my absent wife through imitation, but rather I just want to be here and experience the absolute, right? But that only comes at the moment and at the price of his death.
Yes, I agree. And to me, this end really tells us that for Pascali, desire per se is preferable to fulfillment. Mm-hmm. So I'm reminded somehow of Arthur Schopenhauer's theory that Pascali knew so well, that desire shifts from one object to the other, but it's never satisfied. It just keeps going, taking people from one goal to the next. We want something, we strive for something, we obtain it, and then we grow bored until the next object of desire appears. Mm-hmm. But what we have here is really raw desire. Helen, it's the ultimate object of desire, being so close to death. And she will also seem to desire nothing. That's the strange thing also, that in the story, we are never told about what she wants. She is just the trigger of the story. And it's interesting that then Pat Barker in the book kind of makes Helen a weaver, weaving rich tapestries and weaving stories, as if the author, who's also a woman, wanted to give her some agency, some power over her actions. And I really wanted to finish this episode and leave you all to enjoy the full story with a quote from another modern book again, so we can have a ring composition. And the book, it's Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, which is a classic. And I think this line is very appropriate here. I'm going to go and read it. I think that voice held him most, with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song.
Thank
you so much, Maria, for being here.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Inside the wooden horse, Anticlos cried out in response to that heavenly voice he heard. Or he would have cried out if Odysseus hadn't covered his mouth, saving the heroes still calling out those heroes' names. That winged voice faded into the distance. And finally, all that could be heard was the short breathing of the heroes, just like before, when they were entranced by the enormous hubbub of the waking day, by the crystalline singing of choruses of girls, which they listened to in the dark of night. Then it disappeared, because maybe it was night, and the evening star was already shivering over the sea. Maybe it was night, with a full moon rising out of the hills. And there it was, a voice that circled the wooden horse, and that sounded like the voice that each man most wanted to hear. Every heart has a voice it longs for most. It was the woman that each of them loved, the far-off, unreachable woman they loved, suddenly appearing from across the sea waves in the dark mountains, suddenly there. And each man jumped like he was placing a foot on the mossy doorstep of his home. A look from Odysseus reined them all in. All but Anticlos. Anticlos was a force, but only because he was forced to be. No tales of glory babbled in his heart, just slender cypresses, a sunny vineyard, and his woman, whose voice he now heard. And he was there, across the dark mountains, across the sea waves, and she was pushing the loom away and coming up the stairs. The door was opening, and he opened his lips, and the heavy hand of Odysseus shut them. The man with 100 tricks and ways. Then he heard in the seashell of his ear a harsh whisper, like a cold sea breeze. It's Helen. Helen. Death, you fool. But the voice stayed with him. And when, with the others, he left the horse, the full moon hanging in the middle of the night, the heart within him was blackening with rage. Everywhere he went, he killed, burnt down, destroyed. He tipped the sacred tripods into the fire, drove his sword through maidens' breasts. He didn't want captives. All he wanted was to hear through screams and cries and groans the voice of the woman he loved, his own. But now he was in holy Troy, enemy of glory, and not in Arne, rich in grapes, or in Haliartus, leafy, and Troy went down in a whirlpool of blood out while the moon looked on serenely. The warriors dead. The children were thrown onto the smoking rubble. The women were dragged to the waiting ships, and from Troy in flames to the sky-blue sea, through the Stygian gates, white in the moonlight, the chariots passed, and the cries went on. But Anticlos didn't pass through those gates, nor any other in the walls of Troy. His charioteer waited for him in the gilded chariot with a fresh young slave wailing wildly, and the horses, their reins tied to a fig tree, the wind whistled through, stamped their hooves on the dusty ground, sniffed at the blood and reared at the flames. But Anticlos did not come. He lay in a dark pool of blood, in the high house of Deiphobos, son of Priam. And over him there raged still the lust of battle, the clash of bronze, since, in the fatal footsteps of Deiphobos, the warriors who came in 1,000 ships from Locris, Aetolia, Phokis, Dolopaia, Euboea, still fought with the Trojans over Argive Helen, still struck at each other with their shadowed spears, the bronze-clad, the tamers of horses, as their spears clashed and their long shadows stood out like scars on a city in flames. But Anticlos thought of his woman as he lay there dying in the sonorous hall of that great house, which now went up like a tottering pine devoured by flame. Through the flash, Anticlos saw Leitus standing in the doorway. Immediately he called to him, Leitus, son of Electrion, find Menelaus the conqueror, whose mighty cry of war I hear. Tell him the blood leaks from my veins like wine out of a broken jug. Tell him that I'm dying for him and for his woman, though I have mine in my heart. Tell him to bring Helen, to speak to me in the voice of my woman, the voice that I most want to hear. Every heart has a voice that it longs for most. So he spoke. And Leitus passed through the house, tracking that mighty cry of war. And when it went quiet, he found Menelaus leaning on a spear that ended in a wound, with his foot in the corpse of his enemy. And there sat Helen, silently, high on a throne of solid gold, her feet upon a golden footstool. Leitus said to Menelaus, someone whose blood is leaking like wine out of a broken jug has sent me. Anticlos, who's dying for you and for your woman, though he has his in his heart. So please, let Helen go to speak to him in the voice of his woman, the voice that he most wants to hear. Every heart has a voice that it longs for most. So it was that as Anticlos lay dying, Helen came to him, silently as a dream. Around her the conflagration blazed, and above the conflagration shone the moon. And she passed silently, serenely as the moon, over the blood and flames. The flame soared higher as she passed, the blood cooled in the dying veins. The last houses came crashing down. Men's last gasps hung in the air. She stood over Anticlos where he lay dying, thinking of his woman far away. The warriors fell silent, hoarse from the war cry. The slave girls fell silent in their torn robes, and her mouth was just about to open with that faraway voice, the voice of his woman, so that he could carry it with him to Hades. Her lips were opening when Anticlos said, "Stop. I want to remember you alone."